Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode in a new video series presented by KupoCon, where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in the remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of the unofficial Final Fantasy VII Novelisation, the standalone novel The Nibelheim Incident, which is now an audio series also produced by KupoCon, and the forthcoming book Norse Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of these videos is to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within the remake and to provide a broader understanding for casual and veteran fans alike. This episode covers the opening chapter of the game, the destruction of Mako Reactor 1, which was a playable demo released by Square Enix in March of 2020. There were a couple of things omitted from the demo that we saw in the full version, so I'll be sure to touch on those as well. The video will inherently include spoilers, but anything beyond Chapter 1 is minimal and mainly speculation. However, if you're not familiar with the original story, there will very likely be heavy spoilers. Just for clarity, my knowledge comes from extensive research of the Final Fantasy VII compilation in terms of games and accompanying literature or media over the past 20 years. I've also spent a great deal of time reading, analysing and even translating some of the more abstract content available across the internet. Please note that unless it identifies something as speculation, everything I talk about is factually accurate to the best of my knowledge. So let's get started. Thanks to Square Enix's release on Valentine's Day 2020, we knew in advance that the demo's opening movie was not actually the full version. I really loved this footage as it's both a fantastic way to set the scene for Midgar and finally tie in some of the visual content from the reveal trailer in 2015 when the remake was first announced. For example, the bird soaring over the Midgar wastelands is reminiscent of the one flying among the construction cranes in the initial teaser, not to mention the swans or geese from Naniki's 500 years later scene. It's also pretty amazing to see Midgar in the daylight, which was something many fans had previously speculated on. The detail here is incredible and everything seems so familiar. And thanks to Pixel of the Beyond Midgar page for pointing out the visual connection between the yellow digger and the damaged one that appears in the original game's Sector 6 slums. And of course, when the scene finally changes to the kids playing at the park with the Moogle slide, we see an earlier image where the reactor's Mako fumes are reflected in the girl's eye. In the demo, however, the movie opened as it does in the original game, with Aerith inspecting a leaking Mako pipe. She then gets disturbed by something further down the lane, and quickly makes her exit onto the main street. The camera lingers on the lane for a moment, with the One-Winged Angel lyrics being softly chanted in the background. The player obviously sees nothing there, but the reason for this is more than just suspense. It's revealed in Chapter 2 that only Aerith knows about the black spirits until she touches Cloud's hand, allowing him to see them too. Therefore, at this point in the game, they're invisible to the player. We know the spectres will play a significant role in the remake. Director Tetsuya Nomura gave an interview shortly after Square Enix's E3 conference in 2019, and his translated descriptions of them are something like the Guardians of Fate. Some of the earlier character artwork also suggests they are connected to Sephiroth. As always, everyone's favourite epic Loveless appears on the billboards of the theatre exactly as it has done in previous versions of this scene. Interestingly though, it also shows the same opening date as in the original game, which is the 25th of June. According to the official timeline of the compilation, the bombing of Mako Reactor 1 occurs in December, meaning that this billboard and all the advertisements shown throughout the remake are 6 months in advance, assuming of course the remake follows the same timeline. As is to be expected in HD, when the camera pans up, the image of the city is simply stunning. The intricate detail in the buildings, the expressways, the gaps exposing the slums etc. is off the charts. Curiously, the most common question I was asked about the demo was to identify the extended platform that the camera passes on its way back down towards the train station. If you look closely, there are actually 8 such platforms encircling the Shinra building. These are helipads and additionally appear in Cloud's official wallpaper art. There's also a resemblance to the helipad from Crisis Core where Zack fights Bahamut Fury, albeit that's actually located near the summit of Shinra headquarters. During the train's arrival at the station, the camera lingers a moment longer than usual on the Mako fuel cell on the side of the car. This is interesting as it's the first time we're shown such an energy source. In the old game, it was just assumed that the engines or batteries of vehicles included Mako generators or whatnot, but this provides a pretty definitive visual to what's actually going on. Further to this, a quick scan of the locomotive's exterior will reveal some Japanese kanji and the number 600. This exactly matches the model number from the 3D art renders produced for the original Final Fantasy VII. The Shinra emblem also appears on the side of the train. This is the first time we get a proper look at it, and there's actually a subtle change. Previously the name was written as Shin-Ra, but this was never reflected in the text references to either the company or the family name of Rufus and the President. The same is true throughout the compilation, but here it has seemingly been amended to create a bit of continuity. There's also a retcon on Barrett's design, but not with the obvious shades and vest inclusions. I'm actually talking about his tattoo. Though he does have a flaming skull tattoo in Nomura's original character art, the current design instead comes from Advent Children, which itself was a commissioned creation by a renowned Japanese tattooist. Another little retcon I noticed in the character design is that Cloud's belt is now the Crisis Core version rather than the original, which was subsequently repurposed as the Deep Ground Soldier crest in Dirge of Cerberus. What I did think was really cool though is how Cloud's eyes react to darkness. If you swing the camera around to focus on him when he's in a spot with very limited light, his Mako infused eyes gleam over like a cat's, presumably indicating he can see in the dark. When the gameplay begins, you barely take your first steps before a battle breaks out. It's a couple of Shinra security officers and Cloud makes swift work of them. What's very awesome here however is that the enemies collapse and their bodies dissipate into spirit energy. Quite frankly, this will have almost everything to do with game mechanics and little to do with the Final Fantasy VII lore, but it does create a minor inconsistency. In the compilation, only those with high quantities of Mako in their bodies would immediately merge with the livestream that way. The clones and soldiers in Crisis Core are a prime example of this, but Sephiroth also does it in the original game. From a lore perspective, this suggests the Shinra infantrymen are also rich in Mako, which we already know monsters are, as the Ultimanias tell us that overexposure to Mako is what caused their mutations and aggression in the first place. Conversely, the robots in the Reactor simply fade away. This means that the design team made a conscious decision to show living creatures dissipating as they do, thus indicating a very early introduction to the concept of spirit energy. At the train station, if you look into the distance, you'll spot a clock tower confirming the time is 9:10 at night. This actually differs from the original, where the clock overlooking Fountain Plaza in the opening sequence shows the time to be 10 past midnight. One of the most prominent questions about the remake in recent years has been whether or not it would incorporate details from the Final Fantasy VII compilation, or if it would become its own universe. This is answered almost immediately. Upon entering the interior of the train station, you get to see advertisements for Benora White Apple Juice, including an image of the purple dumb apple as part of the brand. In case you're unfamiliar, Benora is a town that did not appear until Crisis Core, and the juice itself was an invention of Genesis Rhapsodus, the main antagonist of that game. Similarly, there's a billboard for a shampoo called Hair Tonic. The poster itself pokes fun at the typically wild Final Fantasy hairstyles, but it may also be a reference to the soldier fan clubs from Crisis Core, who discuss at length the types of shampoo Sephiroth might use. In keeping with both possibilities, a variety of products are shown on the board. The background of an advertisement that may be less immediately obvious is for a new book in a series called The Adventures of Stamp. On the billboard, it's clear that the name is well known in pop culture. The importance of its placement here is that Barrett repeatedly calls Cloud Stamp during the mission, comparing Cloud to a mutt or doggy of Shinra. The art on the poster also shows the army dog carrying an injured comrade to safety, which, as my friend Dan Hume of the FinalFantasyForums.net has pointed out, may or may not be a reference to Zack supporting Cloud. However, I'll speak more on Stamp in future videos. From the departure boards, it shows that all trains leaving from here are bound for Sector 5. It's unclear if this relates to the plate or the slums, but it's possibly a reference to Crisis Core, where the route Zack takes to Sector 5 of the lower city is from this exact station. It's also worth mentioning that earlier trailers also showed Sector 8 as a destination on the board. On the wall of the station, you can also see the Midgar transit map, the top side of which is understandably a loop. It shows two lines descending to the slums at Sectors 2 and 5. In the original game, the train that Avalanche escapes on passes through Sector 8, and the cutscene shows it beginning its decline straight away. Thanks to the remake's initial gameplay trailer in 2015, we know that the same occurs this time around, so it's unclear exactly how this is supposed to be represented on the transit map. After the first couple of battles, the player gains access to the menu where they can check their inventory, key items, equipment, etc. Accompanying these are basic descriptions. Now, the text associated with the Buster Sword calls it a large broadsword that has inherited the hopes of those who fight. This is yet another indication that the game has incorporated compilation lore, as the sword has a history with Zack and his mentor Angeal, who often spoke of the honour and dreams of a soldier. Similarly, you can view the description of Barrett's Gatling gun when he joins your party. The text says it's custom made and was commissioned specifically to fight Shinra. This suggests a reference to Old Man Sakaki from Barrett's chapter in the official novel On the Way to a Smile. Sakaki is the man who helps him with various adapters before settling on his gun arm. The first key items we find in the game are the Mughal medals, which are collectible. It's not until chapter 8 that their purpose becomes clear, but they are very valuable. Based on multiple playthroughs of the demo, these don't always show up in the same location, and the most I ever managed to collect was 3, though this was helped by respawning boxes. And speaking of items, another minor touch which I love is that the items you pick up now have a little more dimension to them. For example, you won't simply find ethers, you'll find bottles of ether. Another is tufts of phoenix down. I'm not sure about you, but details like this create a very precise image in my mind and adds so much to the world building in my opinion. As I mentioned earlier, there were a couple of things that got cut. The most prominent example is when Jesse asks Cloud if he and Tifa are close. He has a flashback to when they were kids in Nibelheim, but this wasn't in the demo. It shows that even this early in the story, we're being introduced to Cloud's past and complexities. We get a brief glimpse of Nibelheim's square, with Tifa calling to Cloud as she plays with her 3 friends. However, it's ambiguous as to whether these are the same 3 that appear in Cloud's memory while he and Tifa are in the livestream during the original game. As a little tidbit though, they're actually given names in the early material files of the Ultimania Omega, which are Dan, Well and Mayday. Now, I've already spoken about some Easter eggs that relate to Crisis Core, but here's a more obscure one. In the short scene at the President's office, Heidegger mentions there's an ongoing investigation into determining whether this faction of Avalanche is the same group that had made an attempt on President Shinra's life. That's a reference to episode 2 of Before Crisis, where the President is shot by Fujito at the company's offices in Junon. Much of the dialogue during the mission remains true to the original, but it's been changed up a bit, and I for one really enjoyed it. I feel it's an excellent fresh take on the old game's rushed translations and often nonsensical conversations, and there's a lot of ad hoc dialogue as well, which is really quite funny at times. My personal favourite from chapter 1 is the exchange between Cloud and Barrett about the ex-soldier's age. And while we're on the subject of translations, I've noted a number of changes in the enemy names for the remake. It's uncertain whether the original translations were inaccurate, or the creators have quite simply decided to update these. Examples from this chapter are the MPs, which I presume stood for military personnel or military police, are now security officers, and grunts have become shock troopers. The biggest surprise, of course, is that the guard Scorpion is now the Scorpion Sentinel. This does indicate a deliberate amendment, as both guard Scorpions and guard Spiders are fought by Zack during Crisis Core. There's also a really cool function that's been added for the remake. When you press the map button mid-battle, it brings up some information about your opponents. You'll need the assess materia obtained in Chapter 3 to see their health stats or weaknesses, etc. though. What I found interesting about the security officers and shock troopers is that their bios confirm Heidegger's Department of Public Maintenance is now called the Public Security Corps. Assessing the monodrives or robotic enemies also reveal Hojo's science department has changed to research and development, while Scarlet's Department of Weapons Development is now the Advanced Weaponry Division. If you're like me and adored the old Final Fantasy VII, I would recommend taking your time to look around when moving through the various map areas. There's so much hidden in plain sight, and veteran fans will recognise a load of details that have been lifted from the original. An example is the scene where you first get control of Barret to fight off some monodrives and sentry rays. If you don't explore the room, you may not realise it's the same giant furnace from when you step out of the elevator in the previous title. One thing that did strike me as different though, is the way in which the liquid Mako behaves at the depths of the reactor. The original game's background was pretty limited, as it mixed 2D paintings with 3D models, so it's possible that this was how it was always envisioned. However, it seems pretty turbulent beneath the platform where you battle the Scorpion Sentinel, but that could just be the giant pumps. Or maybe this is how Raw Livestream is supposed to act. When Cloud goes to plant the bomb on the reactor core, he has a moment of mental trauma. He sees a black feather floating down onto the grid and evaporating. This obviously relates to Sephiroth, but it's actually a retcon from the original game. The final boss in Final Fantasy VII is the one-winged angel himself, presented in his Safer Sephiroth form. However, Safer Sephiroth's wing is not black, it's multicoloured. In fact, there's no black on it at all. This was actually introduced in Advent Children, and the image has stuck ever since. At the end of Chapter 1, the big plot twist is that Avalanche's bomb fails, but President Shinra authorises Heidegger to use security robots to blow the reactor themselves. Now this is an extremely clever piece of storytelling, as it has pretty significant connotations for the wider plot, but also gets around the issue of the player being part of a terrorist group and the game glorifying terrorism. I've discussed this exact subject several times in interviews and panels, and how Square Enix might address an issue that's ingrained in today's society in a way that it wasn't in 1997. It's also a little nod to the original game when the team returns to 7th Heaven and Jessie gets so confused about the strength of the explosives she built. Simply put, Avalanche never intended this level of destruction. Well guys, this has been my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from Chapter 1, or the demo, of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a message with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads to my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim incident, and much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork, behind the scenes podcasts, and mythology articles, etc. And be sure to look out for my new book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which launches in mid-2020. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, in association with KupoCon, and I'll speak to you again soon.